Hello, welcome to this video about epics for the World Literature class. This short video is to accompany some notes that you can find on our course site, and if you just prefer to read those, there won't be much more than that in this video. If you prefer the spoken format, this is for you. I'd like to start with the definition of an epic. Of course, an epic is a genre or a type of literature, and I'm going to give you 5 pieces to that definition, and then I'll read them all together. The first is that an epic is a long narrative poem, which means it's poetry, it's long, it tells a story. Number 2, it's in an elevated style, which means it's high language, usually quite formal, like we would think of high art or literature today. Number 3, the characters in the story are usually people of high position, kings and heroes such as that. Furthermore, 4, the adventures that take place in an epic form an organic whole. They all cohere together, and they're focused on one central heroic figure, usually on one hero. And finally, number 5, the epic is important to a history of a nation or a race of people, a people group. So altogether now, an epic is defined as a long narrative poem in elevated style with characters of high position whose adventures form an organic whole focused on a central heroic figure important to a history of a nation or race. Next, I'd like to say 3 things about some theories that have floated or have been around about epics. And the first theory was that epics took shape from the scattered works of unknown poets, and they just kind of came together naturally, organically. A different theory is some scholars say actually, even if the materials developed this way initially, they ended up being shaped by a single genius. So a poet who was able to pull those pieces together is a more recent theory. And the third thing I'd like to say about the theory is whether you follow the folk theory, the first one, or the single author theory, we still call these older epics folk epics because there was at least a part of the formation that came from an oral tradition. So we call those folk epics. So that's the theories. Let me go on to some of the shared characteristics. I want to give you 6 characteristics that are commonly shared by this genre of literature we call epic. Number 1, there's an imposing hero or a legendary character. Number 2, the setting is vast. It involves nations or the world or even the universe. Number 3, the action involves great valor or superhuman courage. Number 4, there are supernatural forces, and it's often that we see gods, angels, or demons involved in the stories. Number 5, it's again in an elevated or high style of language, very serious, grand. And finally, the poet, number 6, the poet has objectivity, like a newspaper reporter that's outside of the story proper. So the poet has objectivity is number 6. Next, I'd like to talk about some of the common devices, kind of tools, literary tools that are used that we commonly see. We may not see these in every epic, but it's very common to see these. The first common device is that the poem will open by invoking the muse. Come to me, great muse, and fill me with inspiration to tell the tale of the great hero. So invoking or calling on that muse, that inspiration. Number two, a common device is that the story begins in medias res, which is a Greek term meaning the middle of things. So the story will often start right in the middle of the action, and then the background information comes later. The exposition will follow later on. Number three, the poet often includes catalogs or lists of things, lists of ships, lists of warriors, a catalog of all the armies, all the foods served at a great feast, or all the gifts that were brought before a king. So catalogs or lists of things often appear in the epics. Number four, there are extended formal speeches by the main characters. And these are like monologues that we see appearing in the epics. And finally, number five, there's a common device called the epic simile. And the epic simile, or sometimes called the Homeric simile, is frequently used, and it's a long comparison, an elaborate comparison between two things. And we call that the epic simile, and it's very common to see that device as well. I'd like to close with 6 examples of famous epics, and many of these, if not all of these, are in our world literature book. The Epic of Gilgamesh, Homer's Iliad and Homer's Odyssey are most famous examples. The Old English epic called Beowulf is in our book as well. Virgil's Aeneid, Dante's Divine Comedy, and Milton's Paradise Lost. These are examples, and you can look at them in the book and get more information as we go along to compare these different examples of long narrative poems in an elevated style with characters of high position, having adventures of an organic whole focused on a central heroic figure important to the history or mythos of a nation or race. One final note, the more recent literary examples, like Paradise Lost, are sometimes called art epics rather than folk epics, but they share many, many of the same characteristics. Thank you for listening, and good luck with your tests and studies of epics.